Hey everybody, Brendan Marcello here with another episode of Social Distance on 24/7 Sports. Our guest today, a special one, Phil Steele, the man whose name is synonymous with the start of a football season. It's really not football season until you get a copy of his magazine in your hands. And I'm still waiting on mine right now. I think it might be coming today. Phil's been working really hard on getting those out, and I think mailed them off just a couple days ago. Phil, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. It must have been a hectic last few weeks for you.
Yeah, it always is a hectic last few weeks of the magazine, Brandon. But this year was a different year in the fact that normally we send this last page of the press at the end of May, and this year we sent it out July the 8th. And the reason was they shut Ohio down, so the entire staff couldn't come to work, and I was just here toiling away in an empty office for a couple of months. But the staff was able to return. They came back fully charged, and I got to talk to probably a little over 110 of the coaches out there this year, going over their team with them. So I feel real good about the shape the magazine is. And even if it goes to conference only like the Big Ten and the Pac-12 have, I feel good there, too, because all my forecasts in the magazine, the predictions for how the teams are going to finish, are based on conference record. And so I think that the product came out pretty good this year.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting my hands on it. As you've always promised, it's jam-packed with information, and it always is. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure even with the shortened amount of time and the uncertainty, it's still filled up with all kinds of information. I love going through it and being able to see. It's like, who's the backup, left tackle over at this school? I never know. And then I'll pick up your magazine and know.
Yeah, and third stringers or fourth stringers included sometimes.
It's great. So, Phil, I wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on some of the Power 5 conferences and maybe some teams that you're not expecting to do as well as maybe some others do, but also those teams that you're expecting to do very well. I wanted to start with the ACC. I think Clemson, I think we all agree, is the top dog there. But could anybody challenge Clemson in the conference this year?
Yeah, and Brandon, last year when I looked at the ACC, it was basically Clemson, a cavernous gap, and then who was the number 2 team? We don't even know. There really wasn't another team that is even in Clemson's neighborhood last year. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why in the magazine I rated the conferences for last year and had the American Conference ahead of the AAC due to the fact it was just basically Clemson and everybody else. But this year there are some teams that can challenge Clemson. I think most of them reside in the Coastal Division. When you look at the Coastal, it's probably the most improved division in college football. North Carolina last year was number 103 on my experience chart. This year they're up to number 30, 17 returning starters. Sam Howell at quarterback. You look at Miami of Florida, they had a losing record last year. Well, they're my number 1 most improved team in the country this year. They bring in De'Ara King at quarterback, which I feel is a huge upgrade, and it's the one position that really needed help was quarterback at Miami. They got poor play last year, and then you got Gregory Rousseau at the defensive end spot. 15 and a half sacks as a freshman last year. And they add in Quincy Roche, the top defensive player out of the American Conference, who had 13 sacks last year. Wow, that's a defensive line. And then you go to Virginia Tech. Once again, a team that's up there number 5 on my experience chart. 18 returning starters. Played a lot better in the second half of last year. Once Hendon Hooker took over at QB, he's back. And how about Pitt? Pitt had 3 guys turn down the NFL, and nose tackle Jalen Twyman, strong safety Paris Ford, defensive end Patrick Jones. They also had their top defensive lineman go out last year with injury in Rashad Weaver, as well as defensive tackle Kashawn Camp. All those guys are back this year. And with DeMar Hamlin at safety, along with Ford, they might have the best safety combo in the country. Pitt's going to have a dangerous defense this year, and that makes them a contender. And I think all 4 of those teams are capable of going on the field and giving Clemson a football game in the ACC title game.
It's very interesting, as we've seen over these last several years, it just seems like the ACC is an afterthought in a lot of people's minds just because of what Clemson's doing. But, man, as you mentioned, those teams, especially this last season, we saw the hints. And as you said, with Miami adding all those pieces and the hiring of Rhett Lashley at offensive coordinator go along with that, you can't help but think Miami's got to get better on offense after averaging like 9 points in their last 3 games in each of those games. They've got to be better. And Miami and Virginia Tech certainly going to be nipping on each other's heels in the conference this year.
Yeah, along with North Carolina and Pitt. And then let's not discount Virginia. When I talked to Coach Mendenhall, luckily some of the other magazines had been out already, and he saw everybody picking them fifth or sixth, and I myself picked them fifth. And he seems to think that they're underrated this year. He likes, let's face it, Brandon. Last year, your perception is probably the same as mine on the Virginia offense. Their offense was Bryce Perkins. I mean, Bryce Perkins was everything. He's gone. So what are they going to do? He feels pretty confident in the replacements, Brennan Armstrong, Keaton Thompson, that they'll do well on offense. And their defense last year at Virginia, they allowed 19.7 points per game the first 7 games. And then they got wiped out in the back half of their defense with injuries and allowed 34.5 points per game the last 7. They're in pretty good shape in the defensive front 7 this year. So Coach Mendenhall's a little angry where they're being picked, and I think that chip on the shoulder is going to show when Virginia plays on the field this year.
I don't think anybody would doubt that Bronco Mendenhall is a fantastic coach. I'm looking forward to what he does at Virginia, not just this year, but beyond. And what we saw last year, I think, is just a precursor of what's possible there. Let's move on to the Big 12, where a lot like the ACC, maybe not as wide of a gap, but everybody just kind of assumes Oklahoma. Personally, I think Oklahoma might take a slight step back, but they probably will still end up winning the Big 12. But I mean, how can you argue against Oklahoma, and who are their big challengers in the league this season?
Yeah, and this could be the year. I mean, Lincoln Riley's made the playoff each of his 3 years as a head coach. They just have lost in the playoff. And last year they were missing a couple of key defenders, but they weren't that close to LSU. I think the biggest difference in Oklahoma this year is going to be defensively. I look at their defense, and I think they've got the possibility being a top 20 defense. Ronnie Perkins at defensive end. You look at the linebacking core with Caleb Kelly, Brendan Radley-Hiles. The secondary looks solid with Trey Brown at corner. And then offensively, I think that Spencer Rattler's got a couple of advantages that Jalen Hurts didn't have last year. Number one, it's his second year in the system. Jalen Hurts, it was his first year in the Lincoln Riley system. And remember, the previous 2 transfer quarterbacks had been there 2 years. And the second is Spencer Rattler's probably a better throwing quarterback than Jalen Hurts. He was my number 1 rated quarterback coming out of high school. He's a natural thrower. That's going to make this offense pretty dangerous for Oklahoma. So they do deserve to be the favorites. But I think there's 2 clear-cut challengers to them this year. I know that last year Sam Ehlinger came out and said, we're back, but Texas wasn't really back. They only had 8 returning starters last year. They were one of the least experienced teams in college football, and then their defense got wiped out by injury. Well, this year they jump up to number 34 in my experience chart with 16 returning starters, a deeper core of running backs, and defensively, all those injuries they suffered last year on defense helps them this year because they get the injured players back plus the replacements back. That's going to be a decent defense that Texas puts on the field. And then how about Oklahoma State? Not only did Chuba Hubbard opt to return, but so did Tylan Wallace. And those guys combined with a now sophomore quarterback in Spencer Sanders, who missed the final 4 games, they're going to be explosive offensively. And last year, defensively, they only had 4 returning starters. It was an extremely young defense. Well, 10 starters are back, so the defense will have some bite this year. I think those are your 3 main players with 2 other teams in the mix. TCU, Gary Patterson always bounces back after a losing season. And then what about the job Matt Campbell's doing at Iowa State? A phenomenal job. I would have picked them higher, Brandon, but Iowa State probably plays the toughest schedule of the top 5 teams in the Big 12 because they have to play at Texas, at TCU, at Oklahoma State, and host Oklahoma. It is the toughest schedule of the big boys in the Big 12. So I think it's going to be competitive this year.
At TCU, we always kind of think defense. I mean, they got a pair of safeties there and a linebacker, just pretty incredible. And with the addition of Jerry Kill as kind of a special assistant, he's been labeled by Gary Patterson himself, says, listen, he's the head coach of the offense. Do we see that TCU offense rebound from last year?
Yeah, we do. And, Max Dugan being a sophomore now, I think is a
Yeah.
big plus. And while they lose their top running back in Darius Anderson, the number 2 running back, they've got Zach Evans, who was the number 1 running back out of high school this year. They've got Darwin Barlow, who is a highly rated redshirt freshman. Same thing with Foster they have. So they've got 3 really good running backs. The biggest question I have with TCU, Brandon, is the offensive line. But
Yeah.
Gary Patterson has taken inexperienced offensive lines before and molded them into a solid group. If he can do that, they may have the best defense in the Big 12, and then you add in the veteran quarterback in Max Dugan, and the last 2 times Gary Patterson's had a losing season, they bounced back with 11 wins the next year. I don't know if you could get to 11 in this climate, with wondering how many games they're going to play, but I do think TCU is one of the most improved teams in the country.
I wanted to speak briefly on Kansas. I love Brent Dearman, the offensive coordinator, and what he was able to do there late in the season. Obviously, they've got Puka Williams. They got some other players they've got to replace. Kansas hasn't finished higher than 8th in the Big 12, I think, in like 10 years or more, or something like that. Something crazy. Can Kansas get out of the cellar this season, or what do you think?
I left them there. It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
They only have 11 returning starters this year, and when Dearman took control of the offense, especially against Texas and Texas Tech, they were putting up 48 and 37 points per game. But then after that, 10 against Kansas State, 13 against Oklahoma State, 6 against Baylor. Struggled a little bit down the stretch. So I really don't think the talent has closed the gap with the rest of the Big 12. And the Big 12 is such a competitive conference. I mean, I'm picking teams like Kansas, Baylor, West Virginia down in the lower half of the Big 12. I think it's another year in the cellar for Les Miles and company.
So Baylor are going to take a bit of a step back this year with Matt Rule headed to the NFL and Dave Aranda taking over.
Yeah, and Dave Aranda surprised me before. I'll go back to one year at Wisconsin. He only had 2 returning starters on defense, and they came out and they had one of the top defenses in the country. But the situation he's stepping into is tough. I mean, Baylor got all the way up to 11 wins last year. They got to the Big 12 title game, and this year they only have 9 returning starters, just 2 on defense. They have a first-year head coach, didn't have the benefit of spring practice, got to learn new schemes both offense and defensively. I think that's a really tough situation for any coach. And now Baylor's got a target on their back. They were at 11 wins last year. Everybody's going to be gearing up for them. The schedule's tough. They've got 5 Big 12 road games and only 4 at home. Tough schedule, less experienced. I do think Baylor takes a step back this year.
Does Oklahoma get a playoff win finally?
The possibilities are, if that defense plays as good as I think it can, the chances are definitely there for them to get a win. Now, they'll probably have to knock off a Clemson or an Ohio State, but we saw last year Oklahoma can play up there, and so I think I'm going to call for Lincoln Riley to go out there and get one of those wins this year.
Now, how about that? Okay, so the Big Ten, again, everybody looking at Ohio State. Penn State, I think, loses a little bit. I'm not as detailed as you in this, but Penn State loses a little bit, but they get Ohio State at home this year, which could be the Big Ten game of the year, obviously. How do you see the Big Ten shaking out and maybe some surprise teams that maybe not a lot of us are paying attention to?
I do think Ohio State's biggest challenger in the Big Ten is Penn State. When you look at Penn State, they've got the majority of the team coming back. In fact, last year they were a young team. They lost some key players, and you wondered, could they compete right away? And maybe they arrived a year early last year, getting up to 8-0 and ranked number 5 in the country. But so before suffering those road losses to Minnesota and Ohio State. And, I've talked to Coach Franklin each year since he's arrived there, and this is probably the best team, and it's the deepest team he's put on the field. You look at the defensive line, it's one of the tops in the country. Micah Parsons, maybe the top linebacker in the country. Secondary loaded with talent. They've got a veteran quarterback now in Sean Clifford, something they lacked last year. A deep running back core. They go 6 deep at running back. The offensive line could be among the best in the country. Pat Freiermuth at tight end. It's a loaded Penn State team, and they get Ohio State at home. Now, you wonder how many folks will be on hand for the whiteout conditions on October the 24th, but we'll worry about that late October. As long as we're playing football, we're happy, right? And but I think the biggest contender to Ohio State in the Big Ten is clearly Penn State this year. And if you're looking for a surprise, one of my favorite parts of the magazine is always my stock market indicator.
Mine
teams
too.
that took an unexpected dive the previous year and to bounce back the next year. How about Northwestern and Pat Fitzgerald?
Sure.
Last year, they still had a top 20 defense last year. And guess what? They got 9 returning starters on defense led by Patty Fisher. That's going to be a very good defense. Now, their problem last year, Brandon, as you know, was the offense. They really had none. Poor quarterback play, but they had in Peyton Ramsey from Indiana. Isaiah Bowser, Drake Anderson at running back. The offensive line looks solid. That Pat Fitzgerald is a guy that was 15-1 in Big Ten play, regular season play, heading into last year, and then suffered a horrible year. I think they have that big bounce back year, and they're a surprise contender in the Big Ten West.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what Northwestern can do as they try to kind of get that offense back on track and revamp it a little bit. Moving on to the Pac-12, everybody assumes it's Oregon and USC over there. Some people on the periphery maybe saying maybe Arizona State can kind of crash the party a little bit. What are your thoughts on the Pac-12 this year?
I do think the 2 best teams talent-wise are Oregon and USC. Oregon, you've thought of them 10 years ago was, hey, they're all this gimmicky, fast-paced offense and not a lot of defense and not a lot of physicality, more speed. Well, Mario Cristobal's changed all that up. They're a physical team. They can play defense. They have my number 6 rated defensive line in the country, number 13 set of linebackers, and the best set of secondary in the entire country. Very good on defense. Offensively, the biggest question is they lose 4 guys off that offensive line. But with a building block like Penei Sewell to step in there as a starting left tackle, they're going to be good on the offensive line. Quarterback play looks good with Shaw and Brown, and the skill players look good as well. So they're a talented team. USC has talent throughout. Look at a couple of USC's losses last year. They started their second-string quarterback, his first road start, and USC came up 3 points short at BYU. Their second loss was at Washington with a third-string quarterback making his first road start, and they really had 3 turnovers in the red zone, or that game was a lot closer in 28-14. They had a 3-point loss to Notre Dame. Now, they did lose to Oregon, a poor second half, and then they lost to Iowa in the bowl game, but I think talent-wise they're there. 17 returning starters. If they can stay healthy with Keaton Slovis at quarterback, they're a legitimate threat against Oregon. I think those are the 2 most talented teams. If you're looking for somewhat of a dark horse, I'm going to go with a new head coach, and it is going to be Jimmy Lake at Washington, who's done well with inexperienced defenses. He's got good talent coming back. And, going over the offensive line with him, we both had question marks coming in, but after examining the personnel, we're like, wow, that's a big offensive line. They get the benefit of working against that Washington defensive line in every practice. So I think Washington could be the threat to Oregon in the Pac-12 North, but to me, the 2 most talented teams are USC and Oregon.
And the SEC, is this the revenge tour for Alabama after what happened last year?
Disastrous year. I mean, they finished number 8 in the country. I mean, are we looking at Nick Saban's contract and wondering what's going on with that? That's Alabama fans have to be horrified at that type of finish. Yeah, I think Alabama comes back with a vengeance this year. 12 returning starters. I remember last year, they lost Dylan Moses at linebacker prior to the season. Joshua McMillan. They had to throw 2 true freshmen into the mix. Well, McMillan and Moses are back along with those true freshmen. They've got one of the best linebacking corps in the country, one of the best D-lines. They had 2 freshman starters up front there. They always reload at corner or defensive back. The special teams are solid. Biggest question mark is quarterback. Whether it's Mac Jones or Bryce Young, they're surrounded by talent. In fact, Alabama is my number 1 rated offensive line heading into the year. And I bounced that off the Joe Moore Award Committee prior and didn't get a lot of pushback on that. So it's a very good Alabama team. The one team I think could surprise in the SEC, I know your other challengers are Georgia and Florida out of the East. Everybody looks at an LSU or Auburn. But watch Texas A&M. They are my number 1 surprise team in the country this year. And going over the team last year with Coach Jimbo Fisher in the spring, 2 things stood out to me. Number 1, they played a brutal schedule, and as it was. How about 3 number 1 ranked teams in 1 year? I don't know if anybody's ever done that before. They played Clemson when they were number 1, Bama when they were number 1, LSU when they were number 1. They also played the number 4 and the number 8 teams in the country. The other thing that stood out to me last spring going over the team with Coach Fisher was they didn't have any seniors on that team. It was a young team, that was playing a brutal schedule. Well, this year they have 17 returning starters. Almost everybody is back, including Kellen Mond. Top 15 offensive line, top 15 defensive line, loaded at linebacker and DB. And they may only face one top 10 team this year. So a much easier schedule. The talent, they're going to have to do what LSU did last year, going to Tuscaloosa and knock off Alabama if you want to win the West. But LSU proved it's possible last year, and this is a much improved A&M team that's playing a much softer schedule.
Can Kellen Mond be that elite quarterback for them, taking that step where in close games he can pull through in the fourth quarter?
I think he can. He's everything you want. And the one thing, if you're going to play for Coach Jimbo Fisher, you have to be able to take coaching. Kellen Mond can take coaching, and he's dangerous running and passing. And with that offensive line and a good skills personnel with him, I do think Kellen Mond has a big year this year. And he'd be a dark horse Heisman candidate.
Now in the East, it's Florida and Georgia. Seems to be a trendy pick with Florida maybe upsetting, or not upsetting, but unseating Georgia this season. But now we just got news that JT Daniels has been cleared, the USC transfer. And we got a little bit of a quarterback battle going on between JT Daniels and Jamie Newman, the Wake Forest transfer. What are your thoughts on that two-man battle, so to speak, in Athens, and also the Florida-Georgia rivalry, and who ends up staying on top? Is it Georgia again?
Yeah, and like you said, Florida is a trendy pick this year. I am a defensive guy, and when I look at Georgia, they may have the best defense in the country. I have my number 5 rated defensive line, number 1 set of linebackers, number 4 DBs. I think Jamie Newman holds on to the job. I like what I saw to him with Wake Forest last year. He's a big quarterback, 6'4", 230. When he had his wide receivers available, he was dynamic, almost unstoppable on offense last year. I have Zamir White stepping in at running back, who is my number 1 rated running back out of high school. Last year he was coming off an injury, so he still wasn't 100%. Second year removed from that injury. Look for a big year out of him. The offensive line is always solid there. Now, Florida's got the better schedule. Georgia has to go on the road and play Alabama. Florida gets LSU at home. And Florida only has 3 SEC true road games this year, whereas Georgia only has 3 SEC true home games. But Georgia was the better team last year. I think they still probably are the better team. And if they win that game head-to-head, they win the East. So I went a little out of the box picking Georgia. And I think Florida is going to be the SEC preseason favorite to win that division.
Okay. So who wins the playoff? Who wins the national championship?
Yeah, I went way out of the box here, Brandon. I've got Clemson and Ohio State playing for the title game, with Alabama and Oklahoma making the playoffs. So we're dealing with a lot of chalk there. And I went with Ohio State this year. I was very impressed with what Ryan Day did. I thought Ohio State last year was 2 touchdowns better than the previous year's Ohio State team. I mean,
wow.
The 2018 squad allowed over 400 yards per game, had close calls on a weekly basis. Last year, Ohio State just stepped on everybody's throat start to finish, dominated every game. Probably should have beaten Clemson in the playoff last year. And they've got a veteran quarterback in Fields. They've got 3 guys that turned down the NFL on the offensive line. The defense will be good, as always. And I've got a lot of faith in Ryan Day. So I think they pull it out this year.
Does Justin Fields win the Heisman as well?
I have him winning the Heisman. Although I know that Trevor Lawrence is going to be the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. So I've got him first-team All-American, but I've got Fields winning the Heisman.
Yeah. You know what might hurt Trevor Lawrence there is just that there's so many blowouts. He doesn't play in the final 10 minutes of games, so he can't really, improve his stats as much as he possibly could. It really hurts.
But him. I think the reason he wins the Heisman is he's got more marquee games on it. Now, Oregon's gone off the schedule, not non-conference play. But I think going into Penn State, if they can go into that whiteout condition, come out with a win, he'll also have wins against Michigan, Iowa on the schedule. And with those big wins like that, I think that gives him a better shot.
Final question. No one wants to see it. If the football season's moved to the spring, do we get another edition of Phil Steele's preseason magazine before the spring? Or do you want to do that much work again?
Let's cross that bridge when we get to it, Brandon. I would have to adjust it because you'd have players like Trevor Lawrence and
Right.
Travis Etienne sitting out, and you wonder which players would opt to play, which ones wouldn't. I think I would have to come up with a new version, and I wouldn't have to put as much work in. It'd be more subtracting some players and coming up with a different forecast. But let's cross that bridge when we get to it. I think we're playing fall football this year, Brandon.
I'm with you. Let's get to it. Let's get some football. Let's get it done. Phil Steele joining us on Social Distance. Phil, it's a pleasure. I can't wait to get your magazine in my hand.